A gesture so simple, so ordinary, that it could easily be overlooked in the rush of a regular morning. But for Liam, it was special. "Can we have a group hug before we go?" he asked, and without hesitation his parents joined in, laughing, unaware of the significance that moment would carry. What happens when something so small takes on an immeasurable meaning? How can a simple hug become the most powerful memory of all? This is another beautiful story from Living Narratives, where you feel the true emotion of stories that make you reflect on life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and get ready to dive into an emotional journey. Liam, if you keep playing with your cereal, you're going to be late for school. Sarah chuckled, though there was a hint of exasperation in her voice as she removed a pan from the stove and poured freshly brewed coffee into 2 mugs. At the counter, Liam, his hair messy and his eyes gleaming with mischief, tried to balance a spoonful of cereal on the tip of his nose. He burst into laughter as the cereal tumbled onto the table. "But Mom, I'm practicing for my talent show," he quipped with the kind of disarming innocence that only a 12-year-old could muster. Michael entered the kitchen in a rush, already searching for his car keys as he did every morning. "Sarah, have you seen my keys? I swear I left them on the table yesterday." He rummaged through drawers, frustration creeping into his voice. Sarah shook her head with a tired smile. "Michael, they're where they always are, in the door." He paused for a moment, raised his eyebrows, and dashed off to retrieve them. "You're a genius, you know that?" he said, kissing the top of Sarah's head before grabbing his coffee mug and heading toward the door. The chaos of the morning was, in truth, a kind of organized symphony. Every laugh from Liam, every hurried remark from Michael, every deliberate movement from Sarah as she packed her son's lunch formed a comforting, rehearsed routine. It was the kind of normalcy that made the day feel predictable, stable. Sarah wiped a napkin across Liam's face, earning a protest from him that quickly turned into laughter. "Mom, stop, I'm a grown man already." Suddenly Liam stopped, still holding his backpack, a curious gleam in his eyes. "Before we leave, can we have a group hug?" he asked, clutching the zipper of his bag as if this were the most important moment of his day. Michael and Sarah exchanged glances and laughed. "Liam, we're running late. Group hug will have to wait," Michael said, though not before Sarah shot him a pointed look. "Come on, just for a second," Sarah said, pulling Michael closer. They leaned in, wrapping the boy in a tight embrace. Liam sighed contentedly. "You guys are the best parents in the world, you know that?" he declared, with the conviction of someone speaking straight from the heart. Then everything returned to its usual rhythm. Michael hurried Liam out the door while Sarah adjusted the strap on the boy's backpack. The sound of the car starting echoed down the street, and Sarah stood in the doorway, watching them drive off as she waved one last time. But in that instant, as the car turned the corner, something shifted. A distant honk broke the air, followed by the screech of tires. Sarah, who had just closed the door, froze. Her heart skipped a beat. Those sounds seemed ordinary, normal for a busy city, but there was something about them that sent a shiver down her spine. She tried to shake the thought as she returned to the kitchen, but the feeling lingered, 2014, an unease she couldn't quite name. Outside, the streets carried on with their usual rhythm, cars passing, people hurrying along the sidewalks. But for Sarah, that sound echoed in her mind like a silent omen, planting a seed of doubt she couldn't ignore. Michael's phone buzzed incessantly on the passenger seat as he maneuvered through the early morning traffic. He glanced at it briefly, frowning when Sarah's name flashed across the screen. It was unlike her to call so soon after he had left. She usually saved any questions or updates for later in the day. Something about it unsettled him. Pulling over to the curb, he grabbed the phone, answering with a casual, "Hey, everything okay?" The voice on the other end wasn't Sarah's. It was a man, calm, but with a tone that carried urgency. "Mr. Michael Hart?" the man asked. Michael's heart sank, his grip tightening on the phone. "This is Officer Bennett. There's been an accident involving your son, Liam." He's been taken to St. Andrew's Hospital. We need you to come as soon as possible." The world seemed to blur for a moment, the officer's words reverberating in Michael's ears like an echo he couldn't escape. "An accident," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean? Is he okay?" But the officer's response was measured and non-committal, leaving Michael with more questions than answers. "The doctors will explain when you arrive, sir." Michael's hands trembled as he restarted the car and sped toward the hospital, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear and denial. Liam couldn't be hurt. Just an hour ago they were laughing in the kitchen, talking about cereal and talent shows. The memory seemed too recent, too vivid, to be real. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, the sound of honking cars barely registering as he ran through red lights. Sarah was already in the hospital lobby when Michael arrived, her face pale and streaked with tears. She looked up when she saw him, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. "They haven't told me anything," she said, her voice cracking. They just said we need to wait." Michael wrapped his arms around her, trying to steady himself as much as her. Together, they stood in the sterile, cold environment of the hospital, the antiseptic smell filling their nostrils as they clung to each other, waiting for someone, anyone, to provide answers. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor approached them, his expression grave. "Mr. and Mrs. Hart," he began, his voice soft but firm. "I'm Dr. Reynolds. I need you both to come with me." They followed him down a corridor, their footsteps echoing against the polished floors. The walls seemed to close in around them, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing faintly. Dr. Reynolds led them into a small, stark room, its white walls devoid of any comfort. The moment the door closed behind them, Sarah felt her knees weaken. She clutched Michael's arm as the doctor took a deep breath. "I'm so sorry," he began. "Liam was involved in a severe accident this morning. Despite the efforts of our team, we were unable to save him." The words hit like a tidal wave, crashing over them with unrelenting force. Sarah's legs gave out and she collapsed onto the floor, her sobs echoing in the tiny room. "No, no, this can't be happening," she cried, her hands clutching her chest as if trying to hold her heart together. Michael stood frozen, his mind unable to process the words he had just heard. "This isn't real," he muttered, shaking his head. "It can't be real." Dr. Reynolds stood silently, his hands clasped in front of him as he gave the grieving parents a moment to absorb the devastating news. Michael finally sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands as his body trembled with silent sobs. The room felt suffocating, the air heavy with grief and disbelief. After what felt like hours, Sarah managed to whisper, "Can we see him?" Dr. Reynolds nodded, his face somber. "Of course. Take as much time as you need." They were led to another room, this one dimly lit, where Liam lay on a small hospital bed, his body covered by a white sheet except for his face. Sarah let out a strangled cry as she approached him, her trembling hand reaching to touch his cheek. "He's so cold," she whispered, her tears falling onto his still, lifeless face. "Liam, my baby, I'm so sorry." Michael stood a few steps behind, unable to move closer. He couldn't bear to see his son like this. The vibrant boy who had been full of life just hours ago now looked like a stranger. The memory of Liam's laughter, his cheeky grin, and his request for a group hug replayed in Michael's mind, stabbing at his heart with each recollection. Sarah leaned over, pressing her forehead against Liam's, her voice barely audible. "If I had known, I would have hugged you tighter this morning. I would have told you how much I love you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret and longing. Michael finally stepped forward, his hand trembling as he rested it on Sarah's shoulder. "We need to stay strong for him," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. He felt as broken as she did, the weight of their loss threatening to consume him. As they left the hospital, the world outside seemed cruelly unchanged. The sun still shone, cars still passed by, and people continued with their lives as if nothing had happened. But for Michael and Sarah, Everything had changed. The sound of Liam's laughter was gone, replaced by an aching silence that would follow them home. His ride home was excruciatingly silent. Michael kept his eyes fixed on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel, while Sarah stared blankly out of the passenger side window. The world outside blurred into a meaningless stream of colors. Every turn of the tires felt heavier, pulling them closer to a house that now seemed unrecognizable without Liam's presence. When they arrived, neither of them moved immediately. They sat in the car, the faint sound of the engine ticking as it cooled. Sarah's hands trembled as she unfastened her seatbelt. "I don't know if I can go in." "Go," she whispered, her voice hollow, barely audible. Michael reached over, his hand hesitating before resting on hers. "We have to," he said, though his voice cracked with the weight of his own uncertainty. For him. The house greeted them with an eerie stillness. The smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of the ordinary morning they had shared just hours earlier. Sarah's gaze immediately fell on the kitchen table, where Liam's unfinished bowl of cereal still sat. The spoon was balanced on the edge of the bowl, as if he might return at any moment to finish his breakfast. She let out a strangled sob, pressing her hand to her mouth to stifle the sound. Michael moved past her, his steps heavy as he made his way to Liam's room. The door was slightly ajar, just as Liam had left it that morning. Michael hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob before, finally pushing it open. The room was exactly as it had been, Liam's bed unmade, his favorite action figures scattered across the floor, and the colorful poster of a superhero taped crookedly to the wall. He stepped inside, each breath feeling like a struggle. The scent of Liam's shampoo still lingered in the air, and Michael felt his chest tighten. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands gripping the edge of the mattress, as he stared at the small desk where Liam had written his school assignments and doodled pictures of their family. A crumpled piece of paper caught his eye, and he reached for it with trembling hands. It was a note Liam had written, unfinished but unmistakably in his messy handwriting. "I love you, Mum and Dad. Thank you for always making me laugh." The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut, and he felt tears streaming down his face before he could stop them. He folded the note carefully and pressed it to his chest, his body shaking with silent grief. In the kitchen, Sarah had sunk to the floor, clutching Liam's cereal bowl. She rocked back and forth, her tears falling freely as she whispered, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," over and over again. Her mind replayed the memory of that morning, Liam's laughter, his smile, and his request for a group hug. If only she had held him longer, if only she had known. Michael found her there, his own grief mirrored in her tear-streaked face. He knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her as they clung to each other, their shared pain too immense for words. The weight of their loss was suffocating, and yet in that moment they were united by the love they both carried for their son. The hours passed in a haze, the house filled with an unbearable quiet. Sarah eventually retreated to Liam's room. Unable to bear the emptiness of the kitchen, she sat on his bed, running her fingers over the fabric of his pillowcase. The memory of his voice echoed in her mind, his words from that morning a bittersweet refrain, "You're the best parents in the world." Michael stayed in the living room, staring blankly at the television, though it wasn't turned on. His thoughts were consumed by the image of Liam lying still in the hospital bed, his vibrant laughter silenced forever. The guilt was relentless, gnawing at him with every passing second. He should have protected him. He should have done more. That night, neither of them slept. Sarah eventually made her way to the living room, where Michael sat with his head in his hands. She placed the crumpled note Liam had written on the table in front of him. "He loved us," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Even in his last moments, he loved us." Michael picked up the note, his fingers tracing the words. "We were supposed to protect him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We failed him." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Michael, we didn't fail him. We loved him. And he knew that. He knew." As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, they sat together in silence, holding Liam's note between them. It was a fragile reminder of the love they had shared, and the love that would carry them through the unimaginable pain of his absence. The morning light that crept through the curtains felt like an intrusion. It illuminated a home that had once been filled with life, but now felt like a hollow shell. The kitchen, usually buzzing with Liam's chatter and laughter, was unbearably quiet. The cereal bowl still sat on the table, untouched, a cruel reminder of how abruptly everything had changed. Sarah stood by the sink, her hands gripping the counter as she stared blankly out the window. The world outside carried on as if nothing had happened. Birds chirped, neighbors walked their dogs, cars drove by. It was a stark contrast to the stillness that had settled over her home. She felt disconnected, as though she were watching life continue from behind an impenetrable glass. Michael emerged from their bedroom, his face drawn and pale. He hesitated in the doorway, his eyes flicking to Sarah before quickly looking away. He didn't know what to say. The words felt stuck in his throat, heavy and useless. Instead, he walked past her, grabbing his keys from the counter without a word. "Where are you going?" Sarah's voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it stopped him in his tracks. I need to get out for a bit," he replied, not turning to face her. He couldn't. The pain in her eyes was a mirror of his own, and he wasn't ready to confront it. Sarah nodded, though her chest tightened. She wanted to ask him to stay, to sit with her in the unbearable silence, but she didn't. She watched as he walked out. The door, the sound of it closing, echoing through the empty house. And then she was alone. Unable to bear the quiet, Sarah found herself wandering into Liam's room. It smelled like him, like the strawberry shampoo he used and the faint trace of his favorite bubblegum-scented cologne. She sat on his bed, her fingers brushing over the blanket he had kicked off that morning. Everything was exactly as he had left it. His backpack leaned against the wall, his sneakers tucked neatly by the door. It was as if he might walk in at any moment, flashing that mischievous smile and asking for a hug. Her eyes landed on a small pile of clothes at the foot of the bed. She reached down and picked up a t-shirt, the fabric soft and still warm with the memory of him. Pressing it to her face, she inhaled deeply, tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't try to stop them. She didn't want to. The grief was unbearable, but it was also all she had left of him. Meanwhile, Michael drove aimlessly through the streets, the city blurring past him. He couldn't bring himself to go to work, but he also couldn't stay at home. The house felt suffocating, every corner haunted by memories of Liam. He pulled over at a park, the one where he used to take Liam to play soccer. Parking the car, he sat there, staring out at the empty field. The guilt weighed heavily on him, a constant voice in his head telling him he had failed as a father. He replayed every moment in his mind, searching for something he could have done differently. Why hadn't he been more attentive? Why hadn't he protected Liam better? The questions were endless, and the answers were nowhere to be found. As the day dragged on, Sarah found herself watching old videos of Liam on her phone. His laughter filled the room, momentarily breaking the silence that had settled like a thick fog. In one video, he was dancing in the living room, his movements awkward and endearing as he tried to mimic a routine he'd seen on TV. "Group hug!" he shouted at the end, pulling Michael and Sarah into his arms. They were all laughing, their faces glowing with joy. Sarah paused the video, her finger hovering over Liam's smiling face. It felt like a lifetime ago. When Michael finally returned home, the tension between them was palpable. He avoided Sarah's gaze as he walked into the kitchen, placing his keys on the counter. She followed him, her voice, trembling as she broke the silence. "You can't keep running away, Michael." He turned to face her, his jaw tightening. "I'm not running. I don't know how to do this." "Neither do I," Sarah admitted, her eyes filling with tears. "But we can't do it alone. We need to face this together." Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to argue, to push her away, but he knew she was right. The weight of their grief was too much for either of them to carry alone. He reached out, pulling her into his arms. For a moment, they stood there in the kitchen, holding on to each other as if they were the only things keeping each other from falling apart. That night, as they lay in bed, the silence was less suffocating. It was still heavy, still filled with the absence of Liam, but it was shared. Michael reached for Sarah's hand under the covers, intertwining their fingers. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to remind them that they weren't alone. In the darkness, Sarah whispered, "We'll get through this, somehow." Michael squeezed her hand, his voice low but steady, for Liam. The next morning dawned quietly, with the same oppressive silence that had hung over the house since Liam's passing. Michael and Sarah moved through the motions of their day like shadows, their paths crossing briefly but wordlessly. The weight of unspoken grief sat heavily between them, a chasm. Neither dared to cross. Sarah found herself back in the living room, her hands trembling as she held her phone. She hesitated for a moment before opening the gallery app. She scrolled through the photos and videos, her chest tightening with every image of Liam's bright, mischievous smile. Her finger hovered over a video thumbnail, and before she could stop herself, she tapped it. The video began to play, the sound of Liam's laughter filling the room. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, a superhero cape tied awkwardly around his neck as he spoke directly into the camera. "Mom! Dad! Look! I'm the fastest superhero in the world," he said, leaping to his feet and sprinting around the room in exaggerated slow motion. Sarah laughed softly despite herself, her tears falling freely as the video continued. The scene shifted to one of their evenings together. Liam sat between Michael and Sarah on the couch, a bowl of popcorn in his lap. "Group hug!" he shouted suddenly, flinging his arms around his parents. Michael's startled laugh echoed in the background, followed by Sarah's soft chuckle. "Group hugs are the best part of my day," Liam said with a grin, his voice earnest and full of love. Sarah paused the video, the words reverberating in her mind. "Group hugs are the best part of my day." The phrase struck her like a lightning bolt, a bittersweet reminder of how much Liam had cherished those small moments. She clutched the phone to her chest, her tears coming harder now. "Oh, Liam," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I miss you so much." She knew she had to share this with Michael. Despite the distance that had grown between them, this memory of Liam was something they needed to face together. She found him in the garage, standing idly by his workbench, staring at a set of tools he hadn't touched in days. He didn't look up as she approached. "I found something," Sarah said softly, her voice hesitant but resolute. Michael glanced at her, his expression guarded. She held out her phone. "You need to see this." Reluctantly, Michael took the phone, his brows furrowing as the video began to play. Sarah watched his face closely, her heart aching as she saw the flicker of pain in his eyes. As Liam's laughter filled the room, Michael's hand tightened around the phone, his jaw clenching. When Liam said, "Group hugs are the best part of my day," Michael froze. The phone slipped from his fingers and landed softly on the workbench. "I can't," he said, his voice raw. "I can't watch this right now." Sarah stepped closer, her hand reaching for his. "Michael, we need to face this. We can't keep running from him, from us. He wouldn't want that." Michael shook his head, his breath hitching as he struggled to hold back tears. "I failed him, Sarah. I failed him as a father. I should have protected him. I should have—" His voice cracked and he turned away, his shoulders shaking. Sarah placed her hand on his back, her touch gentle but firm. "You didn't fail him, Michael. We both did the best we could, and he knew how much we loved him. That's what matters." Michael turned to her then, his face streaked with tears. "I don't know how to move forward," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do I," Sarah replied, her own tears falling. "But we have to try, for Liam." That evening, they sat together on the couch for the first time since Liam's death. The video played again, this time with both of them watching. They laughed softly at Liam's antics, cried at his words, and held each other tightly as the video ended. It wasn't a solution, but it was a small step toward healing. Before heading to bed, Sarah turned to Michael. "We need to bring back the group hug," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Michael nodded, his lips curving into a faint, bittersweet smile. "For him," he said, simply. As they stood in the quiet of their living room, they wrapped their arms around each other, holding tightly as the memory of Liam filled the space between them. It wasn't the same, and it never would be, but it was enough for now. The morning sunlight spilled through the curtains, but it did little to lift the heavy atmosphere inside the house. Sarah sat at the edge of Liam's bed, her hands carefully sifting through the scattered remnants of his life. His favorite action figures lay on the floor, a half-finished drawing, peeked out from under his pillow, and his school backpack leaned against the wall. Each item felt like a tiny piece of the boy she had lost, a puzzle that would never be complete again. Her hand brushed against something tucked beneath the bed, and she pulled it out slowly. It was a small, worn journal, its cover decorated with stickers of superheroes and spaceships. Liam's messy handwriting was scrawled across the front, "Liam's Book of Awesome Stuff." Her breath caught as she opened it, the pages filled with lists, drawings, and little notes written in his unmistakable style. Each page told a story. There were sketches of him and his parents, captions like "Me and Mom making cookies" and "Dad teaching me soccer," written in bright markers. But what struck her most were the words he had written under a heading titled "Best Moments Ever." She read each line carefully, her tears blurring the words. "When Mom laughed so hard, she snorted. When Dad helped me build my science project. When we all did a group hug before school." The group hug. It appeared on the list multiple times, each mention underscoring how much those small gestures had meant to him. Sarah's heart ached as she realized how deeply Liam had valued those moments she had sometimes taken for granted. And then, at the bottom of the page, a sentence stopped her cold. "When we're together, I feel like nothing bad can happen." The simplicity of the words, their raw sincerity, hit her like a tidal wave. Liam had always felt safe, loved, and invincible when they were together. The realization both warmed and shattered her heart. Michael found Sarah sitting on the bed, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. "What's that?" he asked, his voice hesitant as he stepped into the room. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes red but filled with a quiet determination. "It's Liam's journal," she said, holding it out to him. "He wrote about us, about how much he loved the little things we did, especially the group hugs." Michael took the journal, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. He paused at the same sentence that had struck Sarah so deeply. "When we're together, I feel like nothing bad can happen." His breath hitched as he read the words, the weight of their son's love and trust crashing down on him. "I didn't know," he began, his voice breaking. "I didn't know he felt this way." "He did," Sarah said softly. "Even in the smallest moments, we were his whole world." Michael sat beside her, the journal resting on his lap. For the first time since Liam's death, he let the tears come freely. Sarah reached for his hand, her touch grounding him as they sat in shared grief and remembrance. That evening, Sarah suggested something she hadn't dared to before. "Let's bring back the group hug," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Michael hesitated, his gaze meeting hers. "Just the two of us," she added. "It's what Liam would have wanted." They stood in the center of the living room, the silence around them thick but not as suffocating as it had been before. Slowly, they wrapped their arms around each other, holding tightly as the memory of Liam's laughter and love filled the space between them. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase the pain, but it was a start, a small step toward honoring their son's memory. As they pulled away, Michael glanced at the journal still sitting on the coffee table. "We should share this," he said, his voice thoughtful, "not just with each other, but with others. Maybe it can help someone else realize How important those little moments are. Sarah nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. Liam would have liked that. The journal became more than just a keepsake. It became a reminder, a symbol of the love that had defined their family, even in its simplest moments. And as they sat together that night, flipping through its pages, they began to feel a glimmer of hope. Not that the pain would disappear, but that they could carry it with them in a way that honored Liam's memory and the lessons he had unknowingly left behind. The days that followed felt like cautious steps on shaky ground. The journal had become a constant presence in their lives, a fragile yet powerful reminder of Liam's love for the moments they had shared. Michael and Sarah began to find solace in the small things, a shared meal, a quiet evening on the couch, or a glance that spoke volumes without words. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light through the living room window, Sarah turned to Michael. "We need to try," she said, her voice soft but firm. "For him." Michael looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Try what?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "The group hug," Sarah replied. "It was his favorite thing. We can't let it die with him." Michael hesitated, his jaw tightening as he struggled with the weight of her words. The idea of recreating something so deeply tied to Liam felt both comforting and unbearable. But as he looked into Sarah's eyes, he saw the determination there, a quiet strength born from the love they shared for their son. "Okay," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's do it." They stood in the center of the living room, the silence between them heavy but not hostile. Slowly they stepped toward each other, their movements tentative, as if afraid the moment might shatter. When their arms finally wrapped around one another, the embrace was tight, almost desperate, as if trying to hold together the broken pieces of their lives. For a moment they stood there, the world outside fading into irrelevance. The memory of Liam's voice echoed in their minds. "Group hugs are the best part of my day." The words brought tears to their eyes, but also a faint, bittersweet smile to their lips. As they pulled away, Sarah wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "He's still here," she said, her voice trembling. In us." Michael nodded, his own eyes glistening. He'd want us to keep going, to hold on to each other. That night, as they lay in bed, Michael reached for Sarah's hand under the covers. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. For the first time in weeks, the silence between them felt less like a void and more like a space where healing could begin. The next morning, Michael suggested something he never thought he'd be ready for. "What if we shared his journal?" he asked over breakfast, his voice hesitant but thoughtful. "Not just with family or friends, but with the community. Maybe it could help others, other parents, other kids, realize how important those little moments are." Sarah considered his words, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "It's a beautiful idea," she said. Finally, Liam's words could inspire so many people. He'd love that. They spent the afternoon flipping through the journal together, carefully choosing pages to share. Each entry was a testament to the simple joys of life, the moments that often go unnoticed but carry the most meaning. They decided to host a small gathering at their home, inviting neighbors, friends, and family to celebrate Liam's life and share his journal. The evening of the gathering, the house was filled with the quiet hum of conversation and the soft glow of candles. Michael and Sarah stood at the front of the room, holding Liam's journal between them. Sarah took a deep breath before speaking, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "Liam taught us that the smallest moments can mean the most," she began. "He loved group hugs, not because they were grand or extraordinary, but because they made him feel safe and loved. He wrote about them over and over in his journal, and now we want to share his words with you, in the hope that they'll remind us all to cherish those moments." Michael opened the journal, his voice trembling as he read aloud one of Liam's entries. "When we're together, I feel like nothing bad can happen." The room fell silent, the weight of the words settling over everyone present. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as Michael continued reading, his voice growing stronger with each word. After the reading, they invited everyone to participate in a group hug in Liam's honor. At first, there was hesitation, a quiet awkwardness as people shuffled toward each other. But as the circle grew, the embrace became genuine, a collective expression of love and unity. In that moment, Michael and Sarah felt Liam's presence more strongly than ever, as if he were standing there. With them, his arms wrapped around their shoulders. As the guests began to leave, one neighbor approached Sarah, her eyes red from crying. "Thank you for sharing this," she said. "It made me realize how much I've taken for granted. I'm going to hug my kids a little tighter tonight." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of grief and gratitude. That's all Liam ever wanted, for us to hold on to each other. That night, as Michael and Sarah sat on the couch, exhausted but at peace, they knew they had taken an important step forward. The pain of losing Liam would never fully disappear, but they had found a way to carry him with them, to honor his memory through love, through connection, and through the simple, powerful act of a group hug. The days following the gathering brought a sense of purpose that Michael and Sarah hadn't felt since Liam's passing. For the first time, their grief felt like something they could share rather than bear alone. The idea of honoring Liam's memory in a larger way began to take shape, growing from a quiet thought into a clear plan. One morning, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Sarah flipped through the journal again, her fingers brushing over Liam's handwritten words. "We should do something more," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Something that not only honors Liam, but also helps others see the value of the little moments." Michael looked up from his coffee, his brow furrowed in thought. "Like what?" he asked, though he already knew where her heart was leading. "A community event," Sarah said, her eyes lighting up with the first spark of hope she'd felt. "In weeks. Something that brings families together. We could share Liam's journal, encourage people to cherish their time with their loved ones, and maybe even bring back the group hug." Michael hesitated, the idea both inspiring and daunting. "Do you think people would come? Do you think it would really make a difference?" Sarah reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "If it changes even one family, if it makes one parent stop and hug their child a little tighter, it'll be worth it." Moved by her determination, Michael nodded. "Okay," he said, "let's do it for Liam." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning. They reached out to friends, neighbors, and local community centers, sharing Liam's story and inviting everyone to the event. Michael used his connections at work to secure a venue, a park not far from their home where Liam used to play. Sarah worked tirelessly to design flyers, each one featuring Liam's words, "When we're together, I feel like nothing bad can happen." On the day of the event, the park was transformed into a vibrant celebration of life and love. Balloons and banners decorated the space, and tables were set up with photos of Liam, his journal pages carefully displayed for everyone to read. A small stage stood at the center, where Michael and Sarah would share their story. As families began to arrive, Michael felt a knot of nervousness tighten in his stomach. What if no one understood? What if their grief was too personal, too raw, to resonate with others? But as he looked around and saw parents holding their children's hands, couples walking arm in arm, and friends embracing each other, he realized they had already succeeded. Sarah stood on the stage, holding the journal close to her chest as she addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice trembling but strong. "Our son Liam taught us that the smallest moments can hold the greatest meaning. He loved group hugs because to him they weren't just hugs. They were a way of saying, we're here for each other, we're safe, we're loved." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "In his memory, we want to remind everyone to cherish those moments, to take the time to hold the people you love, to laugh with them, to create memories that will last long after the moments themselves have passed." Michael stepped forward, then holding a framed page from Liam's journal, Liam wrote these words, he said, his voice thick with emotion. When we're together, I feel like nothing bad can happen. He held up the page for everyone to see. Let's carry that message with us today, and every day. The event culminated in a group hug, just as Sarah had envisioned. Hundreds of people, strangers and friends alike, came together in a massive embrace, their arms intertwined as they stood in a circle under the open sky. Michael and Sarah stood at the center, their hearts full as they felt the warmth of the community. Surrounding them, tears streamed down Sarah's face as she looked at Michael. He would have loved this, she whispered. Michael nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He's here, Sarah. In every hug, in every smile, he's here. As the event wound down, parents approached Michael and Sarah, thanking them for sharing Liam's story. One mother, holding her young daughter's hand, said, "Your son's words made me realize how much I take for granted. I'll never forget this day." That evening, as they returned home, the house felt different, not less empty, but less heavy. Liam's presence was no longer confined to memories. It was alive in the love they had shared with their community. As they stood in the living room, Michael pulled Sarah into a tight embrace. "Group hug," he said softly, the words carrying a new sense of hope. Sarah smiled through her tears, resting her head against his chest. "For Liam," she whispered. "For Liam," Michael echoed. The day after the community event, the energy lingered in Michael and Sarah's hearts like the warmth of a long embrace. The sight of so many families holding each other, of parents lifting their children high into the air with renewed love, was a vision they knew would stay with them forever. But their work wasn't over. In fact, it felt like it had only just begun. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, Liam's journal open in front of her. The words on the page seemed to shimmer with new meaning now, illuminated by the joy and hope they had witnessed at the event. She looked up as Michael entered the room, carrying a steaming cup of coffee. "You know," she began, her voice thoughtful, "yesterday wasn't just about honoring Liam. It was about starting something bigger." Michael sat down across from her, nodding slowly. "I felt that too," he said. "It was like his message. It didn't just stay with us. It spread to everyone there." Sarah smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the edge of the journal. "What if we kept spreading it? What if we made the group hug a symbol, not just for us, but for everyone who's lost someone or who needs to remember how important it is to hold on to the people they love?" Michael leaned back in his chair, the weight of the idea settling over him. "You're talking about something bigger than just one event." "Yes," Sarah said, her eyes bright with determination. "A movement, a way to remind people to cherish the moments that matter most. We could share Liam's journal, his story, his words. Maybe we could even create a foundation, something that helps families come together, supports people who are grieving, or just encourages connection." Michael exhaled deeply, the enormity of the idea both daunting and inspiring. "It won't be easy," he said, "but it feels right." They spent the next few weeks turning their idea into a plan. They reached out to friends, family, and even some of the people who had attended the event, sharing their vision. Slowly but surely, they began to build a network of support. They created a website, a social media page, and a series of videos where they shared Liam's story and invited others to share their own moments of connection. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people around the world. Parents who had started their own group hug traditions, individuals who had reconnected with estranged loved ones, and even those who had simply been inspired to pause and appreciate the people around them. One evening, as Michael and Sarah sat on the couch scrolling through the messages, Sarah paused on one in particular. It was from a father who had lost his daughter years ago. "Your story reminded me of something I'd forgotten," he wrote. "Even though she's gone, the love we shared is still here. Thank you for helping me find it again." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she read the words aloud to Michael. "This is why we're doing this," she said, her voice trembling. It's just about us. It's about everyone who's ever felt this pain, who's ever needed a reminder that love doesn't end with loss. The culmination of their efforts came months later, when they organized a national event, the Collective Hug. The idea was simple. On one day, at one time, people across the country would come together in a moment of unity and connection. Schools, workplaces, community centers, and families in their own homes all joined in, creating a wave of love that rippled across cities and towns. Michael and Sarah stood at the center of the park where it all began, surrounded by hundreds of people. As the clock struck the designated time, they called out, "Group hug!" The crowd erupted into movement, arms wrapping around each other in an overwhelming display of solidarity. Sarah closed her eyes as she felt the warmth of the people around her, her heart swelling with a mix of grief and gratitude. She could almost hear Liam's voice, his laughter echoing in the breeze. "You did this, Liam," she whispered. "You made this possible." Michael held her tightly, his own emotions threatening to spill over. "He's here," he said softly. "In every hug, in every smile, he's here." As the event drew to a close, Sarah and Michael stood together, their hands clasped as they looked out over the crowd. It wasn't just about Liam anymore. It was about everyone who had ever loved and lost, and about creating a world where those connections were celebrated and cherished. That night, as they sat together in their living room, the house felt less empty than it had in months. The pain of losing Liam was still there, but it was no longer the only thing they felt. There was hope now, and purpose, and the knowledge that Liam's memory was alive in every hug, every smile, and every connection they had inspired. Michael reached for Sarah's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "For Liam," he said quietly, the words a promise they would carry with them always. "For Liam," Sarah echoed, her voice steady and full of love. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the living room. Michael and Sarah sat together on the couch, the weight of months of work and grief settling into a quiet sense of fulfillment. The house, though still marked by Liam's absence, felt alive in a new way. It wasn't just a space of loss anymore. It had become a place of hope and connection. Their project, the Collective Hug, had grown beyond anything they could have imagined. The outpouring of love and support from people around the world had created a movement, a reminder to cherish the little moments and hold on tightly to the people you love. Liam's story and his journal had become a symbol of the beauty found in simplicity and the power of human connection. Sarah looked down at the journal resting on her lap, her fingers lightly tracing Liam's handwriting on the cover. "Do you think he'd be proud of us?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Michael turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "He'd be more than proud," he said. "He'd probably be laughing at how many people are doing group hugs because of him." Sarah smiled at the thought, her heart swelling with love and bittersweet joy. "I can almost hear him now," she said, her voice catching. "Come on, Mom and Dad. Group hugs are the best part of the day." Michael chuckled, a tear slipping down his cheek as he imagined Liam's mischievous grin. "He was right, you know," he said. "They really are." Later that day, they walked to the park where the first event had taken place, a place that had become a sanctuary for them. Families played on the grass, children's laughter ringing out in the crisp autumn air. Michael and Sarah stood together at the edge of the field, watching as the world moved forward, carrying pieces of Liam's love with it. As they walked through the park, a little girl ran up to them, clutching a colorful piece of paper in her hand. "Are you Liam's parents?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Sarah knelt down, her heart swelling at the question. "Yes, we are," she said, gently. "How did you know Liam?" The girl held out the paper, which turned out to be a drawing of a family hugging under a bright yellow sun. "My mommy showed me his story," she said. "She said hugs are like magic, and they make people happy." Sarah's throat tightened as she took the drawing, tears welling in her eyes. "That's beautiful," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for sharing this with us." The girl beamed before running back to her family, leaving Michael and Sarah standing there, the drawing clutched between them. Michael looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with emotion. "He's everywhere, isn't he?" he said quietly. "In every smile, every hug, every act of love." Sarah nodded, her tears falling freely now. "He is," she said, "and he always will be." That evening, they sat in the living room, the drawing from the little girl framed and placed on the mantel next to a picture of Liam. The house felt fuller than it had in months, the echoes of Liam's laughter mingling with the love and hope they had worked so hard to cultivate. As the sun set, Michael and Sarah stood in the middle of the living room, their arms wrapped around each other in a quiet embrace. "Group hug," Michael said softly, his voice carrying both grief and gratitude. "For Liam," Sarah whispered, her head resting against his chest. "For Liam," Michael echoed, holding her tightly. And in that moment they felt it, the unbreakable bond of love that transcended even the deepest pain. It was a love that would carry them forward, a love that would inspire others, and a love that would ensure Liam's memory would never fade. As they stood together, the world outside quiet and still, they knew that their journey wasn't over. But for the first time, they felt ready to face it, carrying Liam's legacy in their hearts and sharing his message with the world. The story didn't end with their grief. It began anew with their love. What impact did this incredible story have on you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And if this video moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Living Narratives. Stories like this are created with so much care and dedication to touch your heart and make us all reflect on life. Your support helps us continue bringing more emotional and inspiring narratives. Feel free to explore other videos on our channel, each with a unique and special message. And let us know where you're watching from. The Living Narratives community is made up of amazing people like you who make every story even more meaningful. Thank you for being here with us, and we'll see you in the next video.